There are things a man thinks he knows about his marriage, and then there are the things he discovers when everything falls apart. Elliot Marsh was 43 years old when he collapsed on the ice of a parking lot outside a grocery store in Oakville, Ontario, on a Tuesday evening in late February. One moment he was carrying 2 bags of groceries and thinking about whether he'd remembered to grab the right brand of coffee his wife preferred. The next, he was looking up at a gray sky, unable to feel his left arm, a stranger crouching over him and saying his name, which he didn't recognize until the 3rd time the stranger said it, and even then, it felt like a word in a language he'd only partially learned. The doctors at Halton Healthcare called it a minor stroke. They used the word minor with the careful tone of people who know the word will not feel minor to the person hearing it. Elliot was admitted, stabilized, and by the next morning he was awake, alert, and quietly listening to everything happening around him. That was the part nobody knew. What the medical chart recorded was that Elliot had experienced some confusion and short-term memory disruption. What the chart did not record was that Elliot, lying in that hospital bed with a blood pressure cuff on his left arm and a TV playing news with the volume too low to hear, had made a decision. He understood his surroundings. He remembered his wife's name, his brother's name, the name of his business partner, the address of the construction company he'd built from the ground up over 17 years. He remembered all of it. He chose not to say so. This requires some explanation, not of the choice itself, but of the man who made it. Elliot had spent the better part of the previous 2 years watching something erode without being able to name it. His marriage to Nadine Marsh, née Fontaine, 41, a dental hygienist who'd grown up in Sudbury and moved to the GTA in her mid-20s, had not collapsed in any single dramatic moment. It had thinned, the way ice thins in early spring, still passable on the surface, but hollow underneath. There were no arguments, which was perhaps the problem. There were dinners where they talked about scheduling. There were weekends where they occupied the same house, like 2 courteous tenants who happened to share a kitchen. There were silences that had stopped being comfortable and become something else, something with texture, with weight. He had tried, in the way men who are not naturally expressive sometimes try, badly and infrequently, and usually at the wrong moment. He had booked a weekend in Niagara-on-the-Lake that she attended with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. He had suggested marriage counseling once, and she had said maybe with the tone of someone saying no without wanting to say no. He had watched her and wondered if she still chose him, or if she simply had not yet chosen to leave. Psychologists would describe what Elliot experienced during that hospital night as a form of radical uncertainty intolerance, a compulsion to resolve ambiguity through direct testing when indirect communication has failed. Whether or not Elliot would have used those words, the feeling was simpler. He needed to know. He had come as close as a person can come to not existing. And the thought that terrified him more than the stroke itself was the thought that he might spend however many years he had left in a marriage, where the answer to the question, "Does she still love me?" was something neither of them could say out loud. The morning after his admission, when the neurologist came in to do an assessment, Elliot answered some questions slowly. He paused at names. He said he wasn't sure about certain things. He was not dishonest in any clinical sense. He answered truthfully that he felt confused, that things felt unclear. He was confused. He was unclear. He simply was not confused and unclear about the things the doctor was testing. The neurologist told Nadine, who had arrived at 7 a.m., with a coffee she hadn't touched and dark circles that suggested she hadn't slept, that Elliot was showing signs of post-stroke cognitive disruption and that it was not uncommon and that it could resolve gradually over days or weeks. He recommended observation and rest. He said it carefully and gently, the way you say things to people who are holding themselves very still because they are afraid that if they move, something will break. Nadine sat beside Elliot's bed and held his hand and said his name, He looked at her and let his eyes be a little uncertain, the way eyes are when a person is trying to locate something they know should be there. He hated himself for it, briefly and completely. And then he watched her face. What he saw undid him. She did not look relieved that his injuries were not worse. She did not look inconvenienced. She did not look like a woman performing the role of concerned wife for the benefit of hospital staff. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a very high place, looking down and being afraid in the specific way that people are afraid when they realize they might lose something they had forgotten to measure the value of until this moment. He had expected to feel vindicated or suspicious, or both. He felt neither. He felt grief. Grief for the 2 years they had spent being politely distant from each other. Grief for all the things neither of them had said. But he did not stop. Because he also needed to know about the other people. Elliot's construction company, Marsh and Associates, commercial builds, primarily in the Hamilton-Brantford corridor, was a significant operation. He and his business partner, a man named Gordon Achibi, had grown it from a 2-person general contracting outfit into a company with 47 employees and several active projects at any given time. Gordon handled sales and client relationships. Elliot handled operations and project management. They had been partners for 11 years. They had been to each other's weddings. Elliot's younger brother, Preston, had worked in the company's accounting department for 4 years. It was Gordon who arrived at the hospital first, the afternoon of the second day. He came in loud, the way Gordon always came in, filling a room before he'd finished entering it, backslapping a nurse who clearly had not anticipated being backslapped, dropping into the chair beside Elliot's bed with the energy of a man arriving at a party rather than a hospital room. He said brother 3 times in the first 2 minutes. He held Elliot's hand and shook it and said he was going to be fine, just fine, not to worry about anything at the office, everything was handled. Elliot watched Gordon's eyes while Gordon was talking. They moved quickly to the door, to the monitors, around the room with a kind of inventory quality, cataloging. The doctors said the memory thing could be a while, Nadine said from the other chair. Her voice was careful. He might not know you right away. Gordon turned back to Elliot and his face arranged itself into something warm and accessible. Hey man, it's me, Gordon. We work together. You know me? Elliot let his eyes move to Gordon's face slowly. He gave a small, uncertain smile. Sorry, he said. I'm trying. Gordon's expression did something interesting briefly, before the warmth resettled over it. Interesting in the way a flicker is interesting. Gone before you can be sure you saw it. No worries, man, Gordon said. Take all the time you need. He stayed 30 minutes. He was pleasant and attentive throughout. On his way out, in the hallway where he must have believed he was not being heard, Elliot, whose hearing was entirely fine, caught 2 things. The sound of Gordon's voice dropping half a register and a partial sentence that included the words power of attorney and before things get complicated. Elliot had not spent 17 years managing complex construction projects without developing a reasonably precise instrument for detecting when something was wrong. He lay back against his pillow and said nothing. Preston came the next day. Preston was 38, 5 years younger than Elliot, with their father's eyebrows and their mother's tendency to talk quickly when nervous. He came with a bouquet of flowers from a gas station's, still in the plastic sleeve, and he laughed too loudly when he came in and said, "Looking rough, bro," in the voice of someone who has decided that lightness is the appropriate register and is committing to it regardless of whether it fits. Preston sat for a while. He asked Nadine how she was holding up. He asked the nurses questions that were slightly too specific about Elliot's prognosis timeline. He mentioned, with a casualness that was calibrated, precisely at the edge of too casual, that he'd been talking to the company's lawyer just to make sure things are in order, legally speaking, just in case things take longer to resolve. When Nadine left the room briefly, Preston leaned in close. "Hey, listen," he said. I don't know how much you're following, but I want you to know, whatever you need, I'm here, and I've been making sure Gordon isn't making any moves without checking with the family first. You hear me? Family first. He patted Elliot's arm twice. He left 20 minutes later. It is worth pausing here to note something that psychologists who study family systems describe as a particular kind of secondary exploitation, the kind that occurs not from malice alone, but from the specific combination of pre-existing resentment, financial anxiety, and the sudden removal of a person who has been functioning as the social and economic load-bearing wall of a family structure. Preston had borrowed money from Elliot twice in the past 5 years. He had paid back less than half of it. He had never directly addressed this. The loan existed between them like a piece of furniture neither of them wanted to look at directly. In the weeks that followed, with Elliot still in observation, and then in a rehabilitation facility in Burlington, a precaution his doctors recommended given the stroke's cause and his age, a picture assembled itself, not through dramatic confrontation or single revelatory moments, but through the accumulation of small things, the way patterns become visible only when you step back far enough to see them whole. Gordon had begun having conversations with the company's bank. Preston had been asking the company's office manager questions about Elliot's signing authority and whether it transferred in circumstances of incapacity. A cousin Elliot barely knew had sent Nadine a long email, which Nadine, quietly, had forwarded to Elliot's personal account, thinking he would want to know, suggesting that the family should consult a lawyer because things can get complicated when someone isn't in a position to make decisions. Nadine had written back to the cousin. He is expected to make a full recovery. Please let me know if you have other concerns. She had written it at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Elliot knew this because the timestamp was on the forwarded email. He lay in the rehabilitation facility's bed and read the timestamp and did not know what to do with the feeling that moved through him. He had also, by this point, spoken privately with the facility's social worker, a woman named Dr. Osi Kwame, who was sharp and unhurried, and who Elliot had asked to help him understand the legal landscape around what would happen to his business if his cognitive impairment were confirmed versus unconfirmed, and what disclosures he was and wasn't obligated to make. Dr. Ose Kwame had given him information without judgment. She had also said, quietly, at the end of the meeting, "Whatever you're working through, take the time you need. But don't take so much time that you lose what you're trying to protect." He thought about that. He thought about Nadine. She came every day. Every single day, without exception, for the 31 days he spent in the facility. She came after her shift at the dental clinic, still in her scrubs sometimes, or changed in the car. He could tell by the crease in her hair where her scrub's collar had been. She brought food from places she knew he liked. A sandwich from a Portuguese place in Mississauga. Soup from a Lebanese spot near their house that he'd been going to for 12 years. She didn't make a production of bringing these things. She put them on the table beside him and sat down and talked to him about ordinary things. Something her patient had said, something she'd heard on the radio, something small and daily and real. She held his hand when she left. Once, when she didn't know he was watching through half-closed eyes, in that particular still way that people who are very tired learn to rest without fully sleeping. She stood at the window at the end of his room for a long time looking out at the parking lot. It was raining. The kind of gray Ontario rain that makes everything outside look like a memory of itself. She stood there for several minutes, and her shoulders did something complicated, and then she straightened them, and she came back to the chair. And she picked up a magazine she'd brought, and she read it without reading it, and she stayed another hour before she kissed his forehead and said she'd be back tomorrow. She had stopped wearing her wedding ring in the 3rd year of their marriage. Not in the dramatic way, not a removal. Just the gradual shifting of things. It had been bothering her during procedures at work. and she'd taken to leaving it at home. And then one day the leaving it at home had become the default. Elliot had noticed. He had not said anything, which was perhaps its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked. 2 weeks into his stay at the facility, he noticed she was wearing the ring again. He did not say anything. He stored it beside everything else he was keeping, quiet and careful, in the dark room of things he knew and was not yet ready to say. The confrontation with Gordon happened before Elliot's discharge, because the situation with the company reached a point where waiting was no longer viable. Gordon had attempted to initiate a restructuring conversation with the company's primary bank, citing Elliot's uncertain recovery timeline, and proposing an arrangement that would have transferred significant operational authority to Gordon unilaterally. Elliot knew this because the bank manager, a man who had worked with Marsh and Associates for 9 years and who believed in doing things the way they had been done, had flagged the conversation to the company's lawyer, who had flagged it to Elliot's personal lawyer, who had come to the facility and sat across from Elliot and laid it out plainly. Elliot's lawyer, a careful woman named Anne-Marie Sevigny, who Elliot had worked with for a decade, did not ask him how he was doing before telling him what she had come to tell him. This was one of the things he valued about her, she said. You need to understand what's in motion, and you need to decide what to do about it. He decided. He asked Anne-Marie to arrange a meeting at the facility in the common room on a Friday afternoon, with Gordon and Preston both present. He asked Nadine to be there. He asked that no one be told the specifics of what the meeting was about. They arrived as they had been arriving all along, Gordon too loud, Preston a half step behind his own nervousness, Nadine in the chair nearest to Elliot's with her hands in her lap. Elliot sat up straight. He looked at Gordon first. I remember everything, he said. The room did the thing rooms do when something has shifted irreversibly. It did not change at all, and yet it was entirely different. Gordon's face ran through several expressions in approximately 1 second. Elliot had always suspected Gordon was not at the core a man built for this kind of moment, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked the specific kind of resolve required to hold a position when the ground shifts under it. Gordon had been built for winning, and he had believed until this moment that he was winning. I heard everything, Elliot continued. The conversation in the hallway on your second visit. I know what you've been doing with the bank. I know what you and Preston have been discussing. He said Preston's name, and his brother's face went the color of old drywall. I was never impaired, Elliot said. I was recovering. There's a difference. And I have spent the last month learning exactly what kind of people I have around me. Gordon began a sentence that contained the words misunderstanding and looking out for the company. Elliot let him finish it. Then he said, Anne-Marie is outside. She has documents. You'll have 30 days to arrange a buyout of your shares at the valuation we agreed on in our original partnership agreement. That clause exists for a reason. Preston said nothing. He stared at the middle distance like a man trying to locate an emergency exit that doesn't exist. Elliot turned to his brother. For a moment he said nothing, because there are certain things that require a moment. I love you, he said, and I am genuinely hurt, and we will have to talk about this, not today, but we will. But you are not going to be involved with the company's finances going forward. Preston opened his mouth. He closed it. You can leave, Elliot said. Both of you. They left. Anne-Marie came in, precise and unhurried, and began the process. When it was just Nadine and Elliot in the room, the rain had started again outside. She was still sitting in the same chair, in the same position, with the same hands in her lap. Her expression was not what he had expected. He had expected relief, or vindication, or some version of I told you so, though Nadine had never in their marriage said I told you so, which he was realizing now he had taken for granted. She looked at him for a long time. How long? She said. Since the first night. She was quiet for a moment. That's a long time to be alone in a hospital room. Yes, he said. Were you testing me too? He looked at her directly because she deserved that. I needed to know if you'd stay, he said. I needed to know what we were. Because I didn't know anymore, Nadine. I hadn't known for a long time, and I didn't know how to ask. She looked out the window. The rain moved along the glass in irregular lines. You could have just asked me, she said. I know. I would have stayed, she said. I have always been going to stay. I forgot to make sure you knew that. I think we both did. There is a concept in attachment theory called secure base behavior, the tendency of people in loving relationships to use their partners as a foundation from which to engage with difficulty, trusting that the base will hold. What Elliot and Nadine had lost, over years of careful silence and managed distance, was not the love itself but the visible expression of it, the small daily acts that function as proof, as reassurance, as the ongoing renewal of a promise made once in a formal setting, but requiring constant quiet remaking. She had remade it every day for 31 days in a rehabilitation facility in Burlington. She had brought sandwiches and soup, and she had held his hand, and she had stood at the window in the rain, and straightened her shoulders and stayed. He had not told her he saw that. He told her now. She did not cry, but her face did something quiet and complicated. And then she reached over and took his hand the way she had been taking it for weeks, and they sat there together while the rain came down outside, and the room was very still, and the city went on around them doing what cities do, entirely indifferent to the fact that two people had just found their way back to something they had been afraid was gone. Elliot was discharged 5 days later. He did not recover everything that year. The partnership dissolution was lengthy, and Gordon contested elements of it before finally settling in the autumn. Preston and Elliot had a series of difficult conversations that resolved into something fragile and partial, which was more than Elliot had hoped for and less than he had wanted. The company reorganized under new co-leadership and was smaller for a while before it wasn't. But what Elliot came home to was something he recognized. Nadine was making coffee in the kitchen when he came through the door. Real coffee, the kind she knew he preferred, the right brand. And she turned around when she heard him, and her face did the thing it had not done in a long time. He put down his bag and crossed the kitchen. Nadine Marsh wore her wedding ring every day after that, not because she felt she had to, and not because the gesture was required or symbolic in any consciously performed way, but because something had been lost and found and rechosen, and she wanted to remember what it felt like to choose. So did he.